Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. We're going to use the microphones tonight because we are streaming this event. And so to make sure that the folks at home or the folks that watch the recording at some point can hear adequately, we want to make sure that we amplify the sound. I'm Steve Yanni, superintendent, and the purpose tonight is really to provide some information about our annual budget. If there are questions about the transportation facility, we're happy to take those. We do have a couple board members that are here in attendance tonight that afterwards will be glad to address those. And the reason that we're not talking about that here tonight is because we talked about having that conversation at a regularly scheduled finance meeting so that there can be some good deliberation and information sharing, but we're happy to take any questions that you have tonight. I'm here tonight with Andy Lechman, our Chief Financial Officer, Jen Baldessano, our Director of Finance, Bob Lester, our Director of Facilities, and Prakash Patel, our Director of Innovation and Technology, and Board Vice President Mark Sirota, Board Members Jenna Evans and Jen Ionetti, and Board Member Dr. Art Levinowitz. So, I said Dr. Art Levinowitz, didn't I? Yeah, I thought you were looking. Oh, I was going to say there's going to be a test, so pay attention. Tonight, we're going to talk about our annual budget. Our annual budget is in excess of $100 million, and so it's really important that we share a couple points with you, some things that we're proud of inside the budget, some areas that we know we have to work on in the budget. And there's also a lot of unknowns. The governor gave his budget address today. You know, there'll be now months of deliberation about, you know, what the final allocations are and how that factors into our budget. Last year, the state budget wasn't approved until the middle of July. So school districts are required by June 30th of every year to pass a balanced budget. And we didn't have the budget until the middle of June. In the past, some governors really struggled with getting budgets passed. There have been years that the budget was not approved until well into the next fiscal year, but we don't anticipate that, or we hope that won't be the case this year. I'm going to take the first couple slides, and then Andy is going to do the lion's share of the work around the actual finances. So, as we build the 23-24 budget, we want to make sure that all of you here tonight and those of you that are watching at home or watching at another time understand the budget development process and the budget priorities. So tonight we'll talk about where we want to route the most money we can to, and that's obviously every dollar that we can put into our classrooms is very important to us. The district revenue sources and what the Act 1 index is. Some major expenditures, especially those that we see increasing year over year and that we have year over year. Just like all of you are facing inflation, the district is facing inflation, and apparently we're going to just turn off the lights to save money. But we're also going to talk about the Capital Reserve Fund and planning for capital expenditures. So we recently opened Sandy Run Middle School. We did a facility condition assessment. We have about $50 million worth of work to do over the next decade or so, and how we plan for that and fund those projects. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then we'll talk about, I think we're good right there. Yeah. And then budget open items and the unknowns. So we're going to tell you what the unknowns are right now. And if we think we know when we'll have the answers to some of those unknowns, we'll let you know that. But there will likely be some unknowns like exact state funding, our federal allocations, Title I, Title II, and Title III. We'll talk about that being some unknowns and how we factor all of those unknowns into our budget decision-making process. We want to be able to construct and recommend a budget to the board that's educationally and fiscally sound. I think we can all agree that we want the best possible outcomes for our kids in classrooms. We need to make sure that we're funding our K-12 education program appropriately. Tonight, we'll talk a little bit about some vulnerable areas in the budget. Some of those are the number of kids coming out of early intervention and how we have to plan for that, and how we have to also plan for kids that stay with us beyond age 18. We want to ensure transparency in the budget process. So the budget process kicks off early in the year when we talk about assumptions that we put into the budget and we talk about the preliminary budget. March, April, May, June is when the lion's share of the public discussion happens around the budget, because between October and March is when internally Andy and I are meeting with our principals and our directors to go over their building and department budgets for the next year. And we do a line-by-line analysis. We do something called a needs-based budget. So not looking at what you spent this year and adding a percentage to your budget for the following year, but really constructing a budget based upon what the actual needs are. We have a couple big goals that are research-based. All kids reading on or above grade level by the end of grade 3 and remaining on or above grade level for every year thereafter. Every kid reaching at least proficiency in math by 7th grade, and all kids being able to write at least proficiently across all writing domains by the end of 8th grade. Those are all grounded in research, and we know that if we do not have kids reading on or above grade level by the end of grade 3, catching them up at a later time is exponentially more difficult. We want to continue to incorporate technology that is meaningful. So not technology to replace instruction, but technology to make our work more efficient, and technology to supplement the curriculum, not supplant the curriculum. We talked about a needs-based budgeting philosophy, staying inside the Act 1 index. This year, the Act 1 index is 4.1%. We're going to talk about how we'll be substantially lower with any applicable increase. We'll be well below the Act 1 index. We want to attract, hire, and retain highly qualified staff. So we know that already we have 5 retirements. Those positions have already been posted for next year because they're in high demand areas: an elementary teacher, 2 school counselors, a chemistry teacher, and a social studies teacher. All of those positions will be replaced. We want to evaluate, prioritize, and fund capital projects. For those of you who have watched our meetings before, you know we're working with ICS on a long-range capital plan so that we can build in large expenditures into our budget so that we can continually take care of our buildings and maintain our assets. And then engage the community. So when we say we want public participation, we really mean that. So coming to meetings, submitting comments, emailing. I'm always available if you want to talk about anything. You can always email or call my office. But the lion's share of the budget conversation, as I said, will take place now starting in March and run through approval in June. All right, so I'm going to kick it over to Andy at this point.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. So as Dr. Yanni mentioned, we go through the annual budget process is a year-long process. It's not just a process that we start in March and finish in June. It's really in September already that we start planning for the next fiscal year as part of the process. And what you see up here behind me is the timeline that we follow. We start in September, and we have checkpoints that we go through throughout the year. Really where we're at in the process right now is we're meeting with all of our department and building budget owners to develop their needs-based budget, as Dr. Yanni mentioned. And then that'll start to roll up to, at the March Finance Committee meeting, we'll do a deep dive into the revenue of the district. We'll do a deep dive in April of the expenses of the district. May will be a proposed final, and then June we would bring a final budget before the board for approval. And we must, as a district, all school districts, approve a budget by June 30th each year. So starting at some basics, again, not knowing where everyone is that's kind of tuning in, Act 1 was passed in 2006, and Act 1 is the act that governs school district budget processes. And it sets an index by which property taxes can't be raised each year. So we have a limit as school districts on how far taxes can be increased. As Dr. Yanni mentioned, it's 4.1% for 23-24. It's an index that's calculated by the state and is the same for all school districts. There's an adjustment that happens for some districts, but basically it's 4.1%. School districts can apply for exceptions to go beyond that for three main reasons, but I'll mention two tonight. One is for increases to the PSERS, which is the state retirement system. So if there's expenses that exceed or as expenses grow rapidly with the retirement system, you can apply for exceptions beyond the index. And then for costs related to special education, you can apply for exceptions on a year-to-year basis. Fund balance must be below a required threshold, and the budget can take one of two paths. This year, the board approved a resolution to stay within the index with the preliminary budget. It's called an opt-out resolution. You can also go down the path of a full preliminary budget and approval of exceptions. But like I mentioned, the board in November approved the opt-out resolution to stay within the 4.1 index. This slide is a chart that shows the historical context of the blue line is where the Act 1 index has been. The orange line is where the actual school district tax increases have been over time. And you can see, again, the focus here is on the right side where we are. 6 of the 7 lowest tax increases have occurred over the last 6 years. So we are making a concerted effort to make sure to keep tax increases low to support the budget. You can see this year's budget right now includes a placeholder of 2%, and our forecast that we use for long-range planning includes a placeholder of 2% as well. Again, those are just placeholders to understand how long-range planning and decisions that we're making today impact the future. So property tax lingo, just to understand, I think there's a baseline that everyone needs to understand when you understand school budgets, especially our largest revenue item, which is property tax revenue, is the difference between, I'll focus on the difference between assessed value and market value. So when you think about assessed value is the dollar value assigned to a property to calculate taxes. It's set by the county. It only changes when there's a property tax appeal or when improvements or damage demolition is done on a property. So assessed value is basically what is used to calculate property taxes. Market value is the actual value of your property. So if you put it on the market to sell and it's sold, that would be the market value of your property. And then when you look at how property taxes are calculated, it's simply assessed value divided by 1,000 times the millage rate. And the millage rate represents the amount of taxes calculated per every $1,000 of a property's assessed value. So when you play that out, this is essentially the calculation. Again, I won't go through every step of this, but I think the important point to mention is right now in our preliminary budget, we have a placeholder of 2% as the millage rate increase. So at a 2% millage rate increase, that would be an annual increase of $145 to the median assessed value property across the district. Again, it would be different for every property, but that $197,210 assessed value is the median of all properties in the district. Okay, another important term we'll use throughout this presentation is fund balance. So to understand fund balance, it's simply assets minus liabilities is our fund balance. I try and equate that to make it relevant to your savings account. It's our savings account as a district. And if you think about it, it would be unsustainable for us to pay recurring expenses or in your personal life, pay your mortgage with your savings account. Eventually, that's going to be depleted and run out of money. So when we talk about fund balance, we talk about using it for one-time type expenses, unexpected items such as large assessment appeals. We use it for cash flow purposes. So property tax bills go out in July. So in order to make sure we have enough cash in our bank account to continue to pay bills until property tax revenue comes in, it's essential for that. And the board does have a policy 620, which defines all of our fund balance categories and the levels that we try and keep it at. So one of the things we talk about with budget is protecting the future. And I talk about that. I start here as we look at kind of historically where we've been. The first budget that I presented when I started with the school district in 2019, I presented a budget that included a net change in fund balance, a deficit of $2.8 million, and if everything went as planned, would leave an unassigned fund balance of about $33,000. So it wasn't quite that dire because we have things change as we close years, but we were not in a great financial position. And one of the things we talk about is how we don't go back here and get in this position again in the future. So, oh, sorry, I don't realize that came up next. So the next slide here, this is a slide, a chart that we use quite often. When we looked at November 2019, blue line is expenses, orange lines are revenues. You can see that not only did we have a gap in that current year, but we were also projecting 5 years out that we were potentially going to end up with a $10 million gap between revenues and expenses that needed to be closed. So the idea here is we want the orange line and the blue line to sort of come together so we have a balanced budget. So that's what we were working on my first year with the district. This is where we're at today. So when we look at the preliminary budget that we presented in November, we are in a much better, more stable financial position now today than we were at that point in time. And I think that's something we're extremely proud of. So you look right now, we have revenues of a little over almost 115 million. We have expenses of just about $115 million. We have a planned transfer as a placeholder right now to our capital reserve. We'll talk more about that later in the presentation, of $3 million, which leaves us with a net change in fund balance or a deficit of about $2.7 million. I would say, though, that that is still a balanced budget because our revenues and expenses are matching. We are just intentionally setting money aside to our capital reserve to deal with some pretty significant facility-related items that we have across the district. That would leave us with an ending fund balance of about $6.5 million, which is 5.7% of budgeted expenses. And then this is a similar look to that other slide. So we were growing out in November 2019 to about a $10 million deficit 5 years out. Right now, what we're looking at is in 23-24, we essentially have a structurally balanced budget where revenues match expenses, and the deficit is created by the planned transfer to the capital reserve. And 5 years out, we're looking at about a $3 million deficit that needs to be closed, which in my opinion is extremely manageable, especially as you look at some of the new revenue that's coming into the district from new developments. What this slide gives you an idea of, I'm often asked is, well, in the short term, can taxes be lowered? Because there's funds available now to do so. So what this slide tries to give you an idea of is the orange and the blue line are similar to what you saw on the last slide. The gray line now assumes that, well, what happens if we use the baseline of 0% of a tax increase this year? And what that shows you is that we have a recurring drop of revenue of about $1.7 million forever into the future if that decision was made. And this is where it comes to getting back to protecting the future and understanding how that decision we could make today impacts us for years to come. And you can see that 5 years out where we had that $3 million gap that needed to be closed, now we've got much closer to a $5 million gap 5 years out that would need to be closed if that decision's made today. So ultimately, we make recommendations. It's ultimately the board's responsibility to make that final decision. But we believe that kind of continuing along a path of a 2% increase is responsible and also keeps us in a solid position for 4 years to come. So fund balance, now, just to give you an idea of where we are, fund balance comes in a couple of different categories. Fund balance that I've talked about so far is essentially just the unassigned portion of the fund balance. And that is solely your savings account. That's a district savings account. The other categories of fund balance that we actually do save in other areas, so you can see the different colors there. We have an unassigned fund balance right now of about 9.1 million. We have assigned, that means it's set aside for a specific purpose. So last year, when we closed our budget, we had a surplus of about $5.4 million. And with our recommendation, the board agreed that we would take that money and set it aside for future capital projects. The more money we set aside for capital projects, the less we need to borrow and increase debt service. So that's why that's such an important point for us right now as a district. We have committed fund balances for specific purposes. Committed fund balances are designated by the board, and they can be undesignated by the board by board motion. Real estate assessments, we have $2.5 million set aside for that, and I'll tell you why that's important. If you're familiar with what was the Prudential property, that property, when it was sold to BET Investments, was valued at about $90 million for tax purposes. It sold for $30 million. So what that could ultimately mean to the district, because the property owner is appealing that currently, that could mean an impact of about $800,000 a year in loss of property tax revenue. So we save for those types of scenarios to make sure we can cover those massive one-time loss. Well, that's a recurring loss of revenue forever. So that's why that's important. Health stabilization, we have about $2.6 million set aside, and that's for the increased costs of medical and prescription benefits primarily. And then other are minor items there. So we have different categories of fund balance. I'm usually talking about unassigned as we go through this presentation. So that's high level. Right now I'm going to get into a little bit of revenue detail and expense detail. Revenue sources, every school district has some major revenue sources that they have. We bucket it into major categories of local, state, and federal or other. Local taxes for our school district and many school districts across the state is the largest revenue source that we have. So about 81% of our revenues come from local sources. 18% come from state sources, and then 1%, a little less than 1%, come from federal sources. And then you can see here the trends of each of those. You can see they're all trending slightly higher over time. And federal and other basically don't appear so much on this chart because they're so little. I don't want to call them insignificant because every dollar that we get has value and goes into our classrooms and supporting our students, but primarily you can see local and state are our biggest revenue sources. As you dig into the state sources, there's a couple major items here. There's a couple different buckets where we get sources, but I point out the biggest one here, if you look at this kind of chart, the 1/3 from the right is PSERS. And the largest source of state revenue that we receive is PSERS. PSERS is the mandated state retirement system. And what happens is we as a district pay into PSERS, and then we get a subsidy reimbursement at 50% of our expense back from the state. So you can see that's the largest area of growth as the state. It's part of their budget process, so while you could call it a requirement, it does need to be approved each year. We get 50% back in subsidy of PSERS, but that's the fastest growing item. And all of these items, a number of them, like BEF is basic education, SEF is special education, subsidy, transportation, all have formulas that drive how money comes back to the school districts through those subsidy processes. I will not walk through this in detail, but this just gives you an idea of the calculation that goes into, this is the state's calculation for basic education funding and how it gets out to every single school district. Every school district has all of these data points run through a big calculator, and it spits out at the end how much basic education funding we get as a school district. Our number changes in relation to how everyone else's numbers are changing. So it's not really possible for us to do this calculation by ourselves and say, here's how our basic ed subsidy is going to change. It matters how everyone's data changes in relation to everyone else's. So as Steve mentioned, the Governor Shapiro did present his budget today. He did present an increase to overall education funding, but that has to go through a lot of work now. So we can't just say, yes, that's the final numbers that we're going to receive. We have to pay attention to that over time, and make sure that we know as they're going through the process, we pay attention and understand. We use a budget philosophy of flat until we understand what the final state budget is. It's a conservative model, I know, but until it's finalized, we have no idea what the final budget is actually going to be. New developments have certainly helped us over the last 3 years. So if you're familiar, there's 4 large developments that are happening right now. The Promenade has actually become the largest taxpayer in the district in just about 3 years. So it's certainly, that's one of the ways that we've been able to kind of change the financial position of the district. It's not the sole way, though, because we've done an awful lot of work on the expense side of the budget as well. We have a needs-based budget philosophy. We work with every one of our building and department owners, budget owners, but I don't think we can not pay attention to what's going on here with new developments, because we've had a significant amount of revenue come in, and we have about $2.4 million of anticipated revenue that's yet to come in or be realized as these new developments are finalized. And then this here gives you a sense, while these last 3 years, 21, 22 through current, we've seen an average of 1.4% growth of assessed value from these new developments. It's important to go back and look at the 5 years before those went into place and see that there was basically no change in assessed value over that time. And that was largely because any new assessed value that came in was offset by commercial appeals. We're still seeing commercial properties significantly appeal their assessments, and we're having significant drops there too, but it is being largely offset by the new developments that are out there. So once those new developments are finalized, that will slow down dramatically and likely get back more towards that slow growth 5-year period there from 16-17 to 2021. So we have to pay attention to that as well. And then this gives you a sense of the chart on the right. We are primarily, Upper Dublin, a residential land use. So about 80% of our land use is residential. Commercial makes up about 18%, and then very small amount of industrial or open lots. So this is a comparison of millage rates. Again, it's not easy to compare millage rates across counties, but within a county, you can take a look at millage rates and just see where everything stands. So you can see Upper Dublin, we're here. We are right now about the 3rd highest in the county here, but I note that there's 3.025 mills that were associated with building this building here. They were approved by a voter referendum. Those will eventually over, and you'll see that on a chart later here, those mills will roll off as debt service is paid off on this building. So again, if you pull those 3 mills out, and I'm not trying to make it look better, just so you understand, those mills will come off. We're about middle of the road in the county for millage rate. And millage rate, again, doesn't tell the whole story. So these next 2 comparison slides, I think, are just interesting to look at. This is a comparison of similar districts, of those same districts, of the millage rate and their assessed value by property type. And then it's labeled there, the pink bars are residential, orange is commercial. It's interesting just to note, again, it's just interesting as a comparison, that you see here Upper Marion and Wissahickon are fairly large, much higher in assessed value in the district. And then just when you do that comparison to show that assessed value per pupil, those 2 are much higher. So if we go back here and look at the lowest millage rate, so you can see Upper Marion and Wissahickon, lowest millage rates in the county. They also have the highest assessed value in the county. So again, just points to consider when you're doing comparisons between and among districts. So that's the revenue piece. Again, high level. The hope here tonight is we're giving you high level information, and then if there's any other questions, we can answer that at the end. We'll flip to expenses now and go through high level on expenses. And you can see here that the chart on the left, about 75% of our budget, not so different from other school districts across the state, are made up of personnel costs. Education is a personnel-heavy industry. We have a lot of people. We have a lot of people that need to take care of our kids on a daily basis. So about 75% is personnel, wages, and benefits. Debt service makes up about the other 14 million, and then all other is $15 million worth of expense. And I list out over here, a lot of folks say, well, what's in that all other? Just go cut some costs out of there, and we can make the budget look better. All other is not discretionary. So you can see all of these things kind of fall into that all other bucket: cyber charter school tuition, special education tuition, other professional services and subs, technology, transportation. So there's a lot of stuff in here that's not discretionary, utilities, legal fees, things like that. So that's just a high-level breakdown of what makes up the expenses in our budget. This gives you an idea of the major cost increases that we're facing as we look at the 23-24 budget year. So I'm sure not so surprising, 75% of our budget is personnel. $3 million or so of our cost increases are related to personnel expenses. Those top three line items: wages, medical and prescription, and PSERS, FICAs, Social Security, and Medicare costs. And then we also have the transfer to capital reserve. Now again, that says 2.4 million. We have 3 million in the budget. This is the increase. So our budget this year includes about a $600,000 planned transfer to capital reserve. That represents the increase into next year's budget. So overall, we're looking at new expense items of about $5.7 million next year with that increase of the transfer to capital reserve. And you can kind of see how that plays out with the revenue side of the budget. This chart represents the employer rate of PSERS, the state retirement system. So you can see here in 2010-11, the rate that employers, school districts pay into the system, it's a mandated program. We don't have a choice of if we want to participate or not, was around 6%. So that means $6 on every $100 is what employers, school districts contributed into the PSERS program. Right now, next year, we're at about 35%. Next year, we see it's 34%. It was the first time it's actually gone down slightly since this chart started in 10-11. So that means $34 of every $100 in salary costs we have to pay into the PSERS system. So it's a massive expense. And while it's dropped slightly, it is projected to continue to tick back up for at least 10 years. So we're going to see this expense be at a very high level for the next 10 years or so, and you can see it's already been there. This represents the net cost that we pay in PSERS. So if you remember, I said that we get a 50% subsidy back from the state. So the blue line are the checks that we're actually writing for PSERS. The orange line is the subsidy, the 50% subsidy that we get back from the state. So 14-15, that net cost was about $4 million. Next year, that cost is going to be $9 million. So it's $5 million of costs that have been shifted to local school districts, local taxpayers, as we have to participate in this mandatory state retirement program. Healthcare benefits are another major expense for school districts. We do participate in a healthcare consortium with 10 other school districts. There's 5,300 employees participating across all school districts. So the consortium has actually been very good for us. You can see that last year we actually had a pretty significant reduction, which is kind of unheard of with medical and prescription costs these days. This year and future years, we do budget at a trend of an 8% increase. So that's kind of the industry trend. That's what our consortium uses as they project out. And then the final rate will be set in April. So we do have preliminary rates right now. We do expect it to be less than 8%. We don't know what the final rate is going to be right now, but the consortium is actually working very nicely for us right now, and the other 9, 10 school districts that participate as well. So another major expense, and again, I brought this up last year, and I thought it important to reiterate here, is charter school tuition. And I want to be clear that I think there's a misunderstanding that school districts don't like charter schools or don't agree with charter schools, and I think it's actually the charter school funding process that creates the issue that school districts have here. So you'll see many charter schools say free tuition, and it's free as in public education, right? So we don't charge to send our schools to public education, but what happens is for every student that leaves our district to go to a charter school, whether it be a brick and mortar charter school or a cyber charter school, we have a calculated tuition rate that we must pay to the charter school. So the school district pays for every student that goes to that charter school. It's a tuition rate. You can see for students in regular education programs, it's $17,500 is what we pay, and for students in special education programs, it's about $39,000. And one of the struggles there is that regardless of the student needs in special education, so if a student only needs speech services as an example, we pay $39,000. If a student only needs OT services, we pay $39,000. If there's an IEP in place, it costs us $39,000 regardless of the needs of the student. So I think that's one of the areas that becomes a concern. And you can see that right now, our costs have come down. So in 2021, as everyone did, I think, when we had some of the issues with COVID, we saw an increase in students moving to cyber charter schools. But over time, we've seen that come down. It's still much, much higher than it was before that time period. So we're still around about $800,000 of expense, much, much higher to where it used to be, around $200,000 to $300,000. The second thing I'll say here, just so everyone understands, is when we call it free tuition or the dollars moving with the student where they're receiving education, I think that assumes that there's an incremental cost for every single student that is in that moves to a cyber charter school, and that's not the case. So we believe if every student came back that's in a cyber charter school today, if they all came back into a district program, we would have very little incremental cost to take those students back in. And you can see, because how they're spread out across all of the grade levels, that there's not one grade level that we would have a huge influx of kids. And most of the kids are at the high school. So we could very easily pull all those kids back in and not have incremental costs and have savings of about $800,000 if that occurred. So this gives you an idea of where we're at as far as our debt service. And you can see that, again, I noted here, you can see the electoral debt drop off out here. So we pay right now about $14 million per year for debt service. And you can see the increase here at the beginning of the slide, and that was all of the debt issues for the Sandy Run Middle School, that project that the building's complete. We're wrapping up the site work right now. The total project will be done by August, but we have issued all of the debt to complete that project. You can see we're at sort of a level off point right now. By year 2027, 28 is when we start to see the drop off of the debt service for this building. As this building gets paid off, we will see millage rates go down to match the debt service drop off. And then drop down to, by 2032, a level that's under $6 million a year in debt service. And the orange I have noted there again, there you see kind of the level off there. We were able to refinance a couple of our issues of debt there and save about $2 million. Again, one-time savings. We transferred that. The board agreed to transfer that to capital reserve. We're being very prudent about saving. Again, we had this money for capital projects. Prudent, we save money, set it aside. we have a lot of capital projects, a lot of facilities-related work that we need to accomplish, as Dr. Yanni mentioned, over the next 10 years, 3 to 5 years. There's a lot there. So this just gives you a sense. I'm often asked to give a comparison of cost per student. So I was able to pull this down from a software that we use called Forecast 5. It's Frontline Analytics. And this just gives you a sense. This is a comparison of cost per student to all school districts in Montgomery County. Again, the chart didn't label every district. It just labeled ours to select. So that's what you see in orange there. But there's 2 separate charts here, and it just gives you an idea. The top chart is our cost per student, which is operating costs only. And what that means is take out debt service, take out any transfers to capital reserve, take out anything that doesn't have to do with the operations of our school district directly. And you can see that where we fall in line there, we have about $21 million as our expense per student, and the average across our county is $20,500. The bottom chart then takes into account all costs, including debt service, fund transfers, like everything that hits as an expense in our budget. And you can see where we are. The average is $23,000. We're at about $26,000 per cost per student when you factor in all of the costs. Another key factor when we talk budget is making sure we understand enrollment trends. Do we have any large blips of students coming through that are going to create issues, like as we plan staffing, this is important for us to understand and to look at here. So you can see that elementary, the orange bar there, that was, we had a very low kindergarten enrollment that first year back in September 2020. And then we've seen that we saw the next year, we saw it rebound, and we've seen enrollment kind of tick up at the elementary schools. And then at the middle school and the high school, we've stayed relatively flat. And I think one of the important things to note here is that even as we're seeing the elementary enrollment tick up, we have, as far as capacity, one of the questions that we got is capacity in our buildings. Can it handle this? And we have sufficient capacity in all of our buildings to handle kind of that enrollment growth. I think where we're very careful and mindful, again, needs-based budget, not at just the building department level, but also at a staffing level, making sure we are meeting the needs of our enrollment trends based on class size guidelines, and budgeting appropriately staff for all those needed positions, and not just adding positions because it feels like something we should do. It's very data-driven. Capital Reserve Fund, I've mentioned this a couple of times. We do have a Capital Reserve Fund, and what that is, so when we talk budget, what we're talking about the general fund of the district. So our budget that the board approves is our general fund. We also do utilize a Capital Reserve Fund, and it's completely separate from our general fund. And we use the Capital Reserve Fund to plan for facility needs. We have about $20 million in that fund right now, but we're undergoing a couple projects, right? We've got the project going on at Fort Washington Elementary School, which is comprised of insurance proceeds from the damage that was done from the tornado, and then also the additional Giza project that we have going on there, which kind of brings the rest of the building up to the same standard that the insurance proceed, the damaged portion of the building is being brought back to. So we have that going on. We also know that we have about $16 million worth of projects identified over the next 3 years that we talked about at the last Finance Committee meeting. So again, while I won't go through all of that tonight, those meetings are available publicly. They're on our YouTube channel. Check them out. All the details were there of what we talked about. But as Dr. Yanni mentioned, ICS did a facility condition assessment for us. They identified about $55 million worth of facility capital needs that we have to take care of over the next 10 years. $42 million on here represents, we broke it apart into what are our capital needs versus what are just regular operational and maintenance needs that we'll cover through our facilities budget. So 42 million is truly capital needs. The other 13 million over the next 10 years is just part of our regular facilities and operations general fund budget. The other thing to note, again, it may seem like, $20 million is a lot of money, but APPA, and this was brought up through our facility condition assessment, recommends that you take about 1.5 to 3% of your total your current portfolio replacement value, and that's what you should be setting aside on an annual basis to take care of your facilities. We have about $300 million worth of facility-related costs, the value of our facilities. So really, at the low end of that, about $5 million a year, we should be setting aside to make sure we're properly planning for our facilities. And again, that would be if we're planning to take care of all facility needs with cash rather than borrowing and using debt to take care of those needs. So again, we're at the preliminary point in the process. We're quickly moving towards a final budget in June. We've got about 4 months left to accomplish that. There's some big unknowns that we don't know at this point, even today as we stand here. So again, this was from the November, December timeframe. These were unknowns. Most of these are still unknown today. So where will the final property tax increase be? So we've got a 2% placeholder for now. We feel pretty good as an administration about where we're at, where that's at right now as we look at where our budget is. But every 1% change in the property tax increase is about $860,000. Every 0.1% that changes, it's $86,000. We have some pretty large open assessment appeals from commercial property owners. So we've closed some of these since the November timeframe, but there's 6 of our top 10 taxpayers had appealed their assessed value on their property this year. And Prudential, as an example, 600 Office Center Drive is another one that's open right now. Those are some big ones that will see reductions in assessed value. New developments. Again, one of the things I didn't mention with new developments is, personally, I take a conservative approach. We build in assessed value for new developments as they come online, and we receive reports from the county. We have no idea when assessments are going to come online, how quickly, how much. We know how much is out there and how much we're expecting. We don't know when it's going to come. So I build it in when the county says this assessment is now valid and it will be part of your assessed value for tax purposes. And then state and federal revenue allocations, as Dr. Yanni mentioned, we'll monitor the state budget, but last year the state budget wasn't approved until the school district had to have their budget approved in June, on June 30th, by June 30th. So there's only so much we can do when the state waits to approve their budget until after school district budgets are approved to figure out how much new money we're going to get there. So we'll watch that. Federal revenue allocations are very similar there. On the expense side, so staffing preliminary budgets were based on status quo, so that's typically, unless we see a major area where we need to build in more staff, we usually use status quo for our preliminary budget. Now is when we'll start to really take a hard look at enrollment trends, where there's areas where we need more staff, less staff. We'll look at retirements and how we replace those positions. So that's the work that'll ongo through June. Medical and prescription, as I said, we have an 8% trend. I do expect it to be significantly lower than 8%, but we'll monitor that. We'll get the final rate in April. We'll build that into our budget and update it. And then tuition items are always ongoing and unknown. So special education specifically, there are some students with extraordinary needs, and we know who they are today, but if you have a move-in to the district, or students that are identified and have special needs, those can be costly items that you can't plan for. So we do monitor that pretty closely. Charter school enrollment, we'll monitor that. Again, we've seen it trend down, but we could just find out tomorrow that we have a student that's leaving and going to charter school, and if they have an IEP, that's $40,000. So again, we monitor that through the end of the budget, but a lot of these unknowns will exist even when we approve a final budget in June. And part of our job is just to make sure we've got everything planned to a point where we have everything that we know and taken care of. We use what we know, trends to plan for what we don't know. And then there's certain things we're just never going to know, and we have ways to deal with that. We use a budgetary reserve as an example, where we put $200,000 in a budgetary reserve for just truly unknown special education related items as an example. So that was a lot. I don't know how we're doing on time. I don't know if you have anything you want to add to wrap up.
The other big unknown that we have, I mentioned at the top of the evening that students coming out of early intervention, and I want to be clear that we're not talking about the students being a problem, but we don't learn about the students that are in early intervention until they have a meeting through the intermediate unit to start talking about transition to school. So right now, we could have anywhere between 14 and 40 students coming to us that are leaving early intervention. And they could be receiving services, speech, behavior, they could have developmental delays, they may not be able to attend a public school. And so we will get clarity on those students as they enroll, but sometimes that doesn't happen until we're well into April and sometimes even May. So with that, there were a couple pre-submitted questions that we'll go over just really briefly, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. So one of the questions was already addressed by Mr. Leckman, that if the township continues to grow and there are more houses and apartments, et cetera, do we have capacity in our buildings? And the answer to that is yes, we have capacity in our buildings, sufficient capacity to handle that. Now that Sandy Run is built and open, what's the next school that will be worked on? We talked at our last finance committee meeting about doing an HVAC renovation at Thomas Fitzwater, so that will continue in discussion, and that will be to provide Thomas Fitzwater with a bona fide HVAC system. And the third question that came in, it said, there have been a few news articles about a school funding lawsuit. It sounds like the districts that were involved were struggling financially. There's been a decision in the case, and what's the impact to Upper Dublin? So the decision that the judge made was that there needs to be equitable funding for school districts, but there was no mechanism in the decision from the judge on how to do that. So it goes to the legislature to decide how they're going to disperse funding. So we anticipate that that will be in litigation for several years, and so we don't know yet what the impact of that will be for Upper Dublin. So we have a microphone in the middle of the room, so if you have any questions, please come up and just let us know who you are and what your questions are.
Hi, Judy Vitella Ambler. I don't think I have to do that here. Okay. So I want to know how many buses we have, how many vans we have, how many are used on a daily basis, how many full-time drivers we have, how many part-time drivers we have, how many part-time transportation employees we have, how many full-time transportation employees we have. Do we know the real estate tax cost of the property where the buses are currently sitting? And how much we get, the district gets from that property as real estate taxes. What is the total budget of transportation, the employees, the rent, the repair? You mentioned rent and fuel. When I look at the whole budget, I'm not sure if the employees are in that transportation because it looks like it's in general admin, so I'd like to know that number. How many diesel buses are left in our fleet? I keep saying and I apologize. So we have 20 million set aside in our capital fund, and that is taxpayer money. So we've paid the taxes, they haven't spent it, they've put it aside. So that's our money we've already paid in, the taxpayers of Upper Dublin community. Are we gonna do the project? Do we have a timeline on the projects? I know you mentioned HVAC, My question is, like, Fort Washington's being revamped right now in its entirety, which is great. Well, 2 million short. Will the next building be like Thomas Fitz, we're gonna spend the whole 10 million there that they need, or Jarretown, spend the whole 10 million? Are we gonna do one building at a time, or are we gonna do like piecemeal? Do we have that timeline and what we're gonna do? Because I'd like to know when that money's going out. It seems like our priority might wanna be with that $55 million needed upgrades to all those 4 buildings, Thomas Fitz, Jarretown, Maple Glen, and Upper Dublin High School. They're approximately 10 million apiece. And it seems like that should be a priority in our spending of the 20 million of our taxpayer money that you've saved, and I guess during general fund and future set-asides. When we get these new properties coming online, you mentioned that we have space in the buildings. That's physical space to me, right? Which I get, because I know we talked about, with the tornado and everything else, so I know we have space, even if it comes to like art in a cart, that kind of thing. But the question, I guess, becomes, at what point do we need to hire more staff? Do we have that analysis? So, I'll talk about the property that I can't stand behind my house that got ruined my life and my backyard and my scenery. So it was promised that Upper Dublin School District, the township would get approximately $700,000. My numbers aren't exact, so don't say that I'm lying, please. And the township district was going to get maybe $1 million. And my question is, do we actually end up doing analysis to see if we actually get that number that was promised? And do we associate some costs of maybe children that come in or any other services that might be involved? Do we do I don't think the township does. I'm curious if we do as a school district. You mentioned the drop off of the millage. So when the debt is paid off from the high school, we do get that millage reduction. I think that was one thing with that I think people think that we're supposed to get a tax reduction, but I guess in a way we do because the millage drops off. And am I understanding that correctly, right? And PSERS, is it a correct statement that even though we have a $9 million gap on what we get refunded from the state, PSERS is driven by our salaries, teachers only, all staff, admin, everything, everybody, right? So we have higher salaries. It's known. I'm not saying that's a bad thing or a good thing. I'm just stating a fact that we have one of the higher salaried districts in the state of Pennsylvania. So our payback would be higher based on that. So if you hire more staff and they get paid more, that number's higher and therefore our cost is higher. And I thought you said we got reimbursed 50% of that, right? So that the net cost is the $9 million. Okay, all right, that's it. I think that's it. Thank you.
While we're waiting for the next speaker to come up, I'm happy to briefly address. Just like you said, don't quote me because my numbers might not be correct. I don't want to throw transportation numbers out there tonight because I'm not sure that I have them all correct, but we will put together a document. I listed the information that you talked about, and we'll put together a document. PSERS, that's everybody in the school system. So it's a 50% payback or reimbursement. When we look at when we need to hire staff, we look at class size guidelines. So elementary K to 2, 22 kids, 3 to 5, 24 kids, 6 and above, 30 kids. There are some instances 6 through 12 where we hit that 30 in some unique classes, but typically our class sizes are lower than what the class size guidelines actually state. And regarding the capital budget, ICS was at our last finance meeting to present on the potential HVAC renovation. Thomas Fitz will be the focus, and then based upon discussions in finance, it'll determine where we go next.
Hi, I'm Joan Frizzell, live in Stewart Creek Farm Townhomes. Have experience in education in the university level and very familiar with Philly Public Schools. One of the things that we deal with in Philly Public Schools, particularly my alma mater, is students that have great financial need. And I know from discussions I've had with other people that happens here. And my alma mater, we provide, the Alumni Association raised money to assist with some of the students' special needs, to help with funding AP course, not AP courses, but the AP exams and things like that for students. And I didn't see any mention in the budget as to whether or not there's any set aside or a special fund for students that would have other needs, you know, like the laptop and they need a hotspot at home and that kind of thing. And is that built into the budget? And that may or may not change over time with certain families, but how do you deal with that in your budget?
When students, when either their family expresses a need or we know there's a need, we do work with a number of donors who help offset costs. Around technology, Mr. Patel budgets in his budget to have extra technology if students need it. All of our school counselors work closely with families. We brought in another Lakeside counselor this year. So we don't want a financial issue to be a barrier for any student. So even something like, you know, $20 to be part of an activity. We really encourage families and students, if they have a financial hardship, to have that private conversation with their counselor, and then we always make sure that we either waive that cost or we find a way to pay for that cost. There's a number of folks that we have on speed dial that help with that, in addition to having some funds in our budget.
Jen Kuznets, Fort Washington. In the $16 million to be spent over the next 3 years, what is included in that $16 million? Is a bus depot included in that? And then the $42 million that we discussed, is any of that buses, electric, charging stations? I know we keep talking about electric buses and charging stations, and we need to build a new depot because we want to have electric buses, but in the next breath, it's, well, we don't know if we're going to be able to get electric buses. So I'm just trying to figure out where in that 42 plus 16 million we stand with a bus depot. Thank you.
I'll have Mr. Leckman keep me honest if I misspeak. In the 42 million in the capital plan, we'll make sure it was up on the website. We'll make sure it's up there. That lists it. That was the evaluation of all the systems in all of the buildings. You're looking at me, so I guess you want to answer.
So,
Feel his eyes.
no, so there was a presentation that was given by ICS, which kind of lists all of the information. I will say that what ICS did as part of their facility condition assessment was they evaluated current facilities, and the costs associated with that are the costs to keep all of our current facilities in good working order. So any new transportation facility or cost of EV is not part of that $42 million. Some of the things, and again, this is why I referenced last month's finance committee meeting, so you can certainly go there to see all the details, but some of the things in that $16 million number are, so we're currently at the next finance meeting, we'll look at bids for the Maple Glen Gym roof replacement. We know that there's boiler work that needs to happen at Thomas Fitzwater Elementary School. There's also, we're looking at transferring the Fort Washington Elementary School boilers to the Maple Glen Elementary School and doing building automation system improvements at Maple Glen Elementary School. The Thomas Fitzwater work is included there, so we're looking at a range of projects that could occur at Thomas Fitzwater, but there's about $9 million that's part of that number for Fitzwater. And then the Maple Glen full roof, we know will need to be done over the next 2 to 3 years as well. So Maple Glen, the gym roof is all we're looking at right now, but we have a full roof replacement that will need to take place at Maple Glen. So those are the projects that make up that number right now.
ICS is a construction management company. The district previously worked with Dewey Engineering. We went out for proposal, and we've been working with ICS now for, I guess, a little over 2 years. One of the things that I'll let everyone know that's here and that's watching at home, the full presentation from tonight will be up on the website, and we'll make sure that the questions that are asked tonight are also posted, and any of the supporting document like the facility plan and everything, so that it'll all be available for people to see.
Lance Shapiro, Maple Glen. I wrote down a bunch of questions, so they may not be in any particular order, so forgive me. Thoughts just kind of popped into my head during this, the presentation. I think first thing, I'm just curious, like, do we have a particular fiscal philosophy? I know, Andy, you mentioned several times you prefer to be conservative, which I will say I appreciate. I would rather us take a more conservative approach than just, you know, willy-nilly spending money. I guess in that same breath, and I'm not trying to like pick words out at like one particular meeting and then fitting that to a narrative, but you know, I think you guys understand what I'm concerned about, the bus depot. I understand the current, you know, facility is not great. I've driven by it. It's not fantastic. I get that. But we have about 52 or $60 million that we know we've got to spend, right? So when you think about like how do we define what we need versus what we want or what we prefer to have, right? I think we as residents, as parents, as homeowners, you have to make tough financial decisions. I struggle with, and again, I know the issue's been going on for a while, but for some of us, it feels like it's just happening now. Why spend $10 million at a minimum? Because as we know, whether it's Sandy Run or the high school, like, you're going to go over budget. And not on purpose, but like things come up. Why spend that money today if we don't absolutely need to? There's a narrative that the lease owner doesn't want to continue leasing. That's not what I've listened to at some of the board meetings. I went back and I watched some of the board meetings, and there were questions from board members to you, Andy, and you've said that the current lease owner prefers a longer lease, but we prefer a shorter lease because we want to build a facility. That's what I heard. I get we want to build a facility, but do we need to build a facility? Let's do EVs, let's do electric vehicles. I'm all for that. But we don't exactly know the kind of facility we might need in the future. And I think as we've seen with electric vehicles and infrastructure planning, a lot can change in just a few years. So why build a facility today that we don't necessarily know is going to be the kind of facility we want in the future? That's just my thought process. I know we don't want to continue leasing, but if we have to, and you know, so leasing's costing us $500,000, I think roughly $476. I believe Dr. Yanni, at least one parent has reached out about a potential other facility recently that, from my understanding, would be 1/4 the cost that we're paying right now. Not saying it's definitively the right decision, but instead of spending $10 million, let's spend $500,000 a year or cheaper. Let's invest $9.5 million, maybe get a return, or spend it on something that we know we need today. That's just where my head goes, you know, because again, even the $60 million that ICS has already identified that we can foresee that we're going to need, that's just today. What happens if we get hit by, God forbid, another tornado? Or I don't want it, but I'm just saying, like, we don't know what's going to happen. So I just, again, I'm of the conservative mindset, but spending $10 million on a facility that I think you know by now the township does not want, at least not at the current proposed areas, right? You know, I imagine if you could find a place that's more suitable, yeah, maybe there's always going to be somebody going to complain, but not likely the amount of people that are going to complain, certainly at the upcoming board meeting. So those are just a couple things. I'm also curious, and I know this is a it's more of a district meeting than a board meeting, but I would assume the district, which encompasses the board or vice versa, we would prefer not to make issues political, right? I mean, I think we live in a pretty nice neighborhood, thankfully, at least from what and I've only been at a couple meetings, but from what I watched before, like the meetings are fairly easy, right? For the most part, there's not a ton of public participation. You know, thank God we have Jeannie, at least, you know, she kind of keeps things honest here, right? But we don't want to make things like worse than they need to be. I was really frustrated this past week, and this is kind of going more towards the board, but on the Upper Dublin Democrats page, they posted a rebuttal to basically the bus depot, the folks that are against the bus depot, and I'll put it in quotes. It said, we know we're going to have people that don't want it because it's in quotes in their backyard. I found that really offensive, quite honestly. Somebody from the board must have asked the Upper Dublin Democrats who, you can say no, but somebody thought it was a good idea to do that. Whether they did it directly or indirectly, and it's been taken down, you can say no, but I'm just saying it's, let me finish speaking. Let me finish speaking. I don't want to accuse, but you have to understand just the context of the look, right? All of a sudden, or at least from the perspective maybe of some of you, there are people against that issue. I reached out to a board member to complain about it, and it was taken down very quickly. I am a Democrat. Like, most of us has voted for all of you, you know? Whether it was you directly, and I'm not accusing anyone specifically, I'm just saying, my goal, like, let's not make it that. Like, let's work together. I think what we as parents of students in this district just want is let's work together. Let's not make decisions that at the end of the day aren't for the benefit of our students. I think that's the most, for me, who's just getting involved, the most frustrating thing is feeling like there's a lack of transparency, at least for some of us, whether it's intentional or not. I'm not saying it is, but what can we do to work better together as we're making some of these decisions that affect our community as a whole, right? If you guys need to replace a roof, you got to fix boilers, do it. Like, I don't think many people are going to complain. Maybe you'll always have a few people that want to poke and prod, and I think that's good, keeps you honest, but for the most part, you're not going to get a ton of pushback on that stuff. But when you're talking about changing the little physical nature of our community with a facility that is right up against an elementary school, we're just asking you not to do it. You know, what can we do to find a better solution? Work with the community. You know, if you need help, ask for it. Like, I'm willing to help. I'll make phone calls. I'll go knock on doors down off of Virginia Drive. Hey, do you want to sell some land? Like, we're willing to do that. Don't put it next to an elementary school. It's dangerous. I know you can cite all the statistics in the world and whatever studies that say it's not, but even with that, like, you've done one air sampling study, from my understanding, that was completed in one day for Fort Washington Elementary, and that's all the studies that have been done on either site so far. No traffic studies, no health impact studies, especially, I mean, Maple Glen, there's been nothing. So it's just, what kind of decisions are we trying to make? Can we work together? That's all I'm asking. Thank you.
Charles Liggett from Fort Washington. Glad to see budget presentations haven't changed in 25 years. They're basically the same facts, different figures. I'm reminded of that famous cartoon line, when Wimpy comes to Popeye and olive oil, I'll gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today. Well, we the taxpayers gave you the hamburger last summer. Today is Tuesday. We'd like some of the payment. Now, I see that you're setting aside $3 million from the surplus of this fiscal year. 1.7 of that could go to eliminate the tax increase. And I think after all these years of tax increases since 2003, the taxpayers are due a little respite. Now, I understand the argument, well, if we reduce, the increment 1.7, that's, 1.7, 1.7, oh, it's not. It's a single one-time cost. It's a sunk cost. Doesn't count next year, doesn't count the year after. You can always raise, in fact, 2% is less than half of what you could raise it this year. Appreciate that idea going forward. But I think the taxpayers of this municipality, this school district, are due some respite after funding Maple Glen, after funding the high school, after funding Sandy Run, and all the money. And for example, in 2003, we had an oil leak at Jarratown. Cost $1 million. The school board passed $1 million dedicated tax in the tax increase over and above what they needed. That $1 million never came out after it was paid into the fund. In other words, in 2005, it should have come out. It never did. So it is going forward now for, 20 years. We are due a little respite, and I'd appreciate it, and I think the taxpayers would appreciate it, and it would go a long way to bring the community more in line with some of the good ideas that are going to cost money, that they'd more be willing to spend if they knew that when you didn't need to do it, or there was a time when you could provide respite, that you did. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jen Chaffetz, and so thanks, first of all, for holding this meeting. I know that there aren't a lot of people in the seats, but trust me when I tell you. Really? I know there aren't a lot of people in the seats, but there's a lot of people that are paying attention. This is a tough time for people that are coming home from work, rushing their kids around. So thank you for the transparency and for giving people the opportunity for dialogue. So I have a couple of random thoughts, but I'm going to start with the dialogue part. So I'm an event planner by trade. My job is to solve problems every single day. I work on events for IBM, 50,000 people. Every single day, we have a nightmare to solve. And the only way we solve it is by bringing people together, because collectively we are smarter than anyone individually. We don't do a great job of that here. And I don't understand why. There's something I don't understand behind the scenes between the district and the board and the township and the board, and I don't really understand it. But there's a lot of smart people in our community. And we could hold brainstorming sessions with whiteboards and conversation instead of allowing 4 minutes for people to come up to the microphone with a clock ticking for you to rant your piece. And I think ultimately we all want what's good for our community. So I don't understand why we can't change this paradigm and create task forces and opportunities to share some ideas. So with those ideas in mind, I heard you're using ICIS, not DHUI? Okay, ICS. Is that now our new collaborative partner as we work to do projects? Are we moving away from DHUI?
Yes, ICS is our partner now. We've moved away from Dewey at this point.
Okay, so I'm going to just say,
Right. I mean, right. They're still until the Sandy Run project is completely closed out, but anything that we have, new coming up.
okay, so I just want to say congratulations and yay. Because I don't understand why we're working with them still. I understand we had an enormous six-figure expense associated with not having an ADA compliant space in Sandy Run, and that to me is mind-boggling. And I don't understand why our fields aren't up to the appropriate length to utilize them. I have a daughter at Sandy Run. She never leaves the building. My kid never leaves the building all day long. That is sad to me. All the space, they don't go anywhere. So I'm thrilled to hear about this new partnership. I saw the debt service was 12%, and I heard you say that that in the next 10 years, by 2032, it's going to drop off. I also heard you say that in the next 10 years, that PSERS is going to ramp up. So I just want to kind of call out, how does that look? It's like, oh, it's going to get much better in 10 years. But it's really not. It's also going to get much worse in 10 years, right, as that PSERS comes up, because it sounds like we're going to be just trading one situation for another. And I'm curious, because I don't know, like, what kind of debt service do other, I mean, I saw the charts, I saw how much other districts get from commercial or industrial entities, but what kind of debt service are other communities carrying? Is 12% like the norm? Is that on the low end? Do other districts not have any debt? Like, I'm just trying to figure that out. And, you know, in thinking through all of our projects, it seems like we don't have enough money to get through everything that we need to do at all of our buildings. Some of them are severely in need of updating, Thomas Fitz being the first one. Now I understand Maple Glen needs some roof, and there's work to be done at FWES. So it does seem to me like this bus depot thing is confusing, because we don't have any electric buses. I haven't seen a timeline or a cost associated with obtaining those buses. And we're going to, it's like if I were to buy a house with 7 bedrooms without having a partner, I wouldn't do that, right? Without knowing if I would have a family to fill the bedrooms. Like, it just seems to me we should maybe wait to spend that. And to piggyback on what Lance said, you know, the areas, you've heard it from a million people, I'm just going to say it. Drove down today at Lime Kiln Pike, and I thought to myself, my goodness, I cannot even make a right on red here between the hours of 8 and 4. How could we possibly think that we want to add an enormous amount of vehicles coming in and out of this area that already you can't even make a right on red on Monday, between Monday and Friday, between 8 and 4? So it does, and of course, the historic significance of the fact that I think we were gifted that land, and then going back to our kids that really need that land, because as a parent who talked about the other parents that can't be here, we already have kids that are out way too late trying to get them through the practices, and we just don't have enough space. So I would implore you to please think about what I said about opening up the dialogue. I don't know, can't we park our buses in our parking lots at the school district, at schools, until we need them in the next morning? Immediately accessible, they go out, they get the kids, they come back, they park. I don't know. I mean, somebody suggested that to me. I was like, well, that's a great idea. Maybe before we throw $10 million at this and get all of our residents really angry, because I haven't heard anybody come forward yet and say, I like this idea, this makes sense. Maybe we can just think it through a little more. So that's it. Thank you.
Howdy, Ted Fricker, Drescher. Couple things. Thank you for doing this, first of all. This is great. I learned a lot tonight, I'm not going to lie. I don't know a lot about school budget. I certainly want to know more, because obviously it's our taxpayer dollars, but I appreciate you doing this. Couple things, though. Something, you know, we talk a lot about the rent of a certain facility that we're storing certain vehicles in. $75,000 rent, $75,000 in taxes is money that comes back to us for renting that facility. I'm assuming that if we vacate the facility, they're going to be the first one looking for a tax reduction as well. So that money may disappear. I don't know. Just sort of think about, like, when you talk about the Prudential property, I mean, it's just staggering to me to think that we're going to have that kind of a payback, which makes sense. But these folks that we're paying the money back to are supposed to be partners with us in the community. They're on boards in this community. You would think that they'd be partnering with us to try to make sure they're making a great community when they're, you know, pilfering our land and doing all the things that drive me nuts, because I'd like open space in our community. Given that, there's a lot of potential increase in units in the, whatever, industrial parks, what I've always called it, I don't know what it is now, whatever. I know this, you showed an uptick in enrollment, but it didn't seem very significant. And I'm surprised by that. I mean, I guess the question is, what did we expect with the promenade and what did we get? I'm curious, because I think you said that we're at 85% now, which means they're probably close to, capacity, things like that.
I'm just going to interject
Sure,
here.
please.
I think the estimate was 18 kids, and I think we have 1 or 2.
1 or 2? Wow. Okay, interesting. Because I mean, the numbers, I mean, we keep hearing at least 500 units more coming to us. So it's curious to see what that impact's going to be. But I'm shocked by it, actually. It's surprising to me. And the other, I'm just real quick on the facility. When we rent, there's no maintenance. We don't have to worry about ICS looking at a building because we can tell the landlord to do it too, which is sort of a good thing too, but that's here or there. And it's sort of funny to me, I mean, because I still think of Maple Glen as a new school. I went to Jarretown. I feel like Jarretown's the same school I still went to. It doesn't look any different. It's crazy to me to think Maple Glen needs a new roof. I'm like, Maple Glen? I'm like, Jarretown doesn't, whatever. But just sort of an interesting dynamic to me. I'm sorry about that. Working with the township, I mean, again, I'm disappointed no one from the township is sitting here. I'm not sure what shared services we can do with them. Is there ways, we're in a unique position where we can share a footprint. I love Jen's idea about, task force with folks of the township. I'm on the open space committee meeting because I believe in this township and I want this township to be the best it can be. I think there's a lot of people who will put a lot of minds into a lot of things that we can do to make sure we're doing the right thing by everybody. I think it comes off sort of wrong when we're sort of told what's happening, even though people are voicing displeasure. We'd like to think we're being heard. And it feels like, I think that's what some of the people are saying. And I think any way you can engage public, like, as I said, just like this is great, thank you, is a good thing. It's a good thing to make everyone feel like they're being heard, but they're also hearing what you're having to say in a sort of in a good way, which is nice. So I think that's not only the task force, but or whatever community groups we can put together, but the township should be involved in that, finding ways we share the same footprint, which is unique. Not many townships and districts get that opportunity, so we should try to work together any way we can, because when we work together, we're only better. Finally, it's funny, I noticed you put 2 slides in there about charter school funding. I saw nothing about what enrollment went to private schools that is to the benefit of the district. And it's sort of a yin and a yang, You can complain about charter school funding, but you don't boast the benefit of kids going to private school. And I guess the question I have is, as a parent who had kids go to charter school, have you reached out to the kids and the parents of the kids and asked them why? Have you tried to find out why they went to see if there's a reason they can come back? Maybe, and I get that folks are going to do whatever they want to do, but I guess if you want to see how to reduce that cost, it's talking to people to find out why they did and see what's different that maybe that the district could embrace, things like that. So just something to think about. Thank you.
Hi, Caitlin Johnson, Ambler. Some of the things that I was going to talk about have already been said, so I just want to give an echo to some of those things. I first was wondering a lot about the township, the communication that is between the district and the township, because I feel like what they do impacts the district and what the district does impacts them. And so I was also thinking about, like, is there already a committee that exists that has like a commissioner, a board member, plus like the head of Park and Recs, open space, that you guys collaborate, even if it's just something once a year, so that way it isn't always someone finding out something secondhand. And maybe you guys already have that and we just don't know it. The other thing I was curious was about all the extra homes that are being built, but you're now saying that even though we're having more homes, there's not necessarily more children. Is that projected to be the same in the future? Because I do hear about more projects that are coming up, and I don't think they're all 55 plus, so I was just curious. I went to Fort Washington, and I was there when they were building the kindergarten wing. And something that is interesting to me, and now my kids go to Fort Washington, is that it is pretty much now the same blueprint, but I do feel like there's more kids that go there than when I went there, and it's on the same lot, but the traffic is now more. So maybe when we're talking about having all these developments, is that impacting the schools in a different way than maybe just more the number of kids? And does this impact our budget in any way? Just curious about the relationship between, we're all in the same community, what are they doing that impacts us that we don't even realize, and what are we doing to impact them if we're not having open communication? Maybe we are. Maybe I'm just repeating myself. The other question I had was a little bit, it was like slide 34. You had talked about debt service, and I was curious if that debt service, you were saying it would eventually decrease, but did that already include or amount for the things that we're already gonna do with the buildings? So like, is it included that it's gonna drop off, but that's also with us adding, what, $5 million every year? Like, it's, for some reason, it just doesn't add up in my mind. Like, if we been doing the $5 million since forever, or is it something that's now new that we should do? And $5 million each year seems really short to be able to do all the things that we think we need to do. And I don't know if you could just explain that slide in reference to what we're doing and how that's going to work out better, if that's possible.
Yeah, so I'll quickly address. So this is debt that's already been issued. So it's separate. This is not the capital reserve fund, right? So this does not account for any new debt that may be issued in the future. There are no current plans to issue debt in the future. So the $5 million that we're talking about setting aside in the capital reserve fund, that's going to the capital reserve fund to pay cash for projects. This is where we've issued debt and we pay debt back, kind of like you pay a mortgage back.
So are we not anticipating needing to borrow any more and create any more debt with what we need to do? Like, are we going to be able to save over the next, I don't know, 10 years to be able to pay for everything we need to with cash?
I think it's possible, but I think we don't know what projects we're going to need to do. So I think as projects are approved, like we're talking about the Thomas Fitzwater project, we believe we can pay for that with cash. We don't need to issue debt to do that. But if we talk like the next project will be Jarretttown, we'll start to talk about Jarretttown, then we'll have to consider where we are at financially. Can we pay for a project with cash, or do we need to issue debt? So I think it's part of the decision tree that needs to happen as we evaluate projects.
And we only have the decision tree based on the evaluation of the schools at this current moment. That would evolve if something were to break or whatnot. And that doesn't include the bus depot currently.
The transportation facility is
not on the 10-year plan.
Is not on the 10-year plan right now. It's something that's being considered.
Okay.
But again, I think it's important to note that's why we're setting money aside is for future projects, right?
Yes. So we're setting money aside for future projects, but yet we already have so many projects we know we need right now.
That's correct.
Okay. But they intersect.
Right. So
Yes.
like the report that our ICS gave to us.
I did see that. That was great.
So not all that work has to be done right now. It's over a period of 10 years. And so the money we're setting aside in the capital reserve will be as we go through the years to be able to pay for those things in cash instead of taking on more debt service.
So in theory, we project that we will be able to do that with how everything is going right now.
So the hope is, except for a large project like a Jarretttown, right?
Yes.
And I don't want anyone to think we're, I'm just
Yeah.
I'm just trying to projecting out. I can see the headlines on supporting Upper Dublin students tomorrow that Superintendent Yanni says Jarretttown is next. Just make sure you spell my name right. It's with a V, not a PH. We want to be able to do all of those projects because what we've heard loud and clear is that the district carries a lot of debt service. And one of the questions earlier was, are we in line with other districts? It's as varied as the districts are. I think we are on the high side in terms of debt service. There's no question about that. So as we go through, so ICS did this report. We have $50 million worth of work to do over 10 years. Let's make sure that we're paying for that instead of issuing more debt to just compound the debt service.
Thank you.
And along with the question about students and more homes and more traffic. So we did a demographic study in 2020, and I'll be bringing forth a recommendation to have that study updated in July of this year. And what that demographic study does, it looks at every home purchase, it looks at every live birth, it looks at all the development permits that have gone in the township, and then they project out in a 3-year span and a 5-year span. And so far, they've been pretty accurate. One of the reasons we see much more traffic when the pandemic hit and we brought kids back, and we saw decreased ridership on buses and increased parent guardian drop off, right? So, right, and so there's a state law that says you have to have a seat for every applicable rider on the bus. So whether the student opts to take the bus or not, we have to provide a seat. And so, you might look and, you might see a bus at the elementary level that's rather full. Middle school and high school, well, middle school is still rather full, but high school you see buses that aren't as full because obviously as kids get older, they don't want to take the bus. But we have seen, I think, initially we saw a huge percentage decrease in ridership, and it's come back a little bit, but I don't think we're back at the ridership before the pandemic. See, I always ask questions sheepishly because if Andy doesn't agree with me, he gives me the. So I think that's why. So my office, it's right across from Maple Glen, and so I always know when it's 2:45, despite school getting out at 3:30, because at 2:45 the first car starts lining up, and the car line at all of our schools have increased exponentially since the pandemic. Going back to charter and private school. So private school, we, at the end of 8th grade, always a number of kids leave us. It's a negligible number because typically what happens, we'll lose 15 and we pick 15 kids up. The kids that left us during the pandemic, particularly for OLM and some of the other elementary schools, have come back to us. The reason we don't do that same analysis with charter schools is because there isn't a direct payment there. We always go back to look at class sizes, right? So if we would all of a sudden stop losing kids, and I don't mean that in a bad way, because every school district I've worked in, at the end of 8th grade, there's always some flight to private school. If we didn't lose a number of kids to private school, we may then need to up staff, but we always look at class size guidelines.
Hi there. Thanks for doing this, by the way. It means a lot. Eileen Seeberger, Fort Washington. I'm just wondering, what obligation does the school district and the township and the emergency services have to collaborate, right? To work together, because, we're paying for everything. We want to have the best for our kids. We're not saying don't do it. I completely agree. Let's figure out a way. I want to spend the $10 million, but I don't want to spend it today. I want to make sure that we are going to get the best bang for our buck. And I feel like you guys and the school board and all of the services that are provided to all of us that pay it have an obligation. You have a fiduciary responsibility to work together to share those costs, so that maybe we could pay $9 million. You know what I mean? Like, maybe we're not going to pay everything. If some of those overlapping services can be bundled, that's all.
So I want to address collaboration with the township, because I was surprised to hear that I was the one that didn't want a collaborative relationship with the township. And I know not everyone has met me here, but I'm largely a delight. Isn't that right, Mrs. Vitella? Absolutely. Mrs. Chaffetz? Mr. Fricker? Come on. Right, Caitlin? You know. Andy knows. Look, he's going to give me a talking to about that comment tomorrow. I think, we have quarterly meetings set up with the township, and it's me, Andy, Bob Lester, Mark Sirota, Stan when he was on the board, and on the township side, it's the township manager, usually 2 commissioners, chief of police, Derek DeRica from Parks and Rec, and sometimes Tammy Echevarria, and Dan Wade, the assistant chief. So where those meetings stopped was when the previous manager left and there was a transition period. We've reestablished those meetings. And so the purpose of those meetings is two-way information sharing. And I don't want anyone to interpret what I'm about to say, because I don't mean this in a negative way. The relationship with the township isn't a two-way relationship. They have, like, we need them more than they need us in many situations, right? They need us for space, for youth sports, et cetera, et cetera. Anytime we do a construction project, we need them for permits. We need them for land development. We need them for all these things. And so it's not an equal relationship. That doesn't mean it's not collaborative. It's just not equal. On the workforce side, our support staff is unionized, their staff is unionized. And so when you're working with two different bargaining units, there aren't always great opportunities for workforce sharing. So sometimes people say, you have a grounds crew, the township has a grounds crew. Can it be one grounds crew? We're two separate entities. Not impossible, but there would have to be negotiation between those, those bargaining units. I think there are many opportunities for collaboration with the township. I'll give a shout out to the new township manager. I think he's great. I think, he's very responsive. And I think the relationship will be on a more equal footing now under his relationship. Whether there's real collaboration around what we're talking about now, to be determined, but that doesn't mean if there is collaboration now, that's great, and there'll continue to be collaboration in the future. But if there's not collaboration now, it doesn't mean that there won't be collaboration in the future. So, everything we do has to go through the township, because they hold permits, they hold inspections, special inspections, land development, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The fiscal philosophy, Andy and I, when I first came to the district, Andy and I worked together. In my previous district, I was superintendent and CFO. And one of the things I really respect about Andy, it's 7:43, and I haven't had dinner yet, so we're good. What I really respect about Andy is Andy believes in a needs-based budgeting philosophy, and so do I. Because when you're not needs-based and you're just looking at increasing your budget year over year, you get these budgets that are fictitious, right? And so one of the reasons we need to continue to have the conversations about what we're going to build and when we're going to build it and how we're going to allocate funds is because we want to make sure that we can continue to do all of our due diligence in making sure that we're doing the best job that we can for the community, right? And so we might not always see eye to eye on everything, but I actually am happy that we moved the next finance meeting off of next Tuesday night, because there was a conflict. Well, there were multiple conflicts, but one of them was with the stated meeting at the township, and it's going to allow that public participation to continue, right? I think when we think about staffing in our core classes, we look at our class sizes, right? So we know when there are bubbles, we watch enrollment all the time, and there are times where we have to add teachers. For example, this year's kindergarten at Fort Washington throughout the year got big. We're probably only a couple students away from adding a teacher for next year. And we're always watching, because even though class size guidelines are 22, 24, and 30, doesn't mean that your superintendent wants 22, 24, and 30, right? Because 30 on paper sounds great, but 30 in reality is not great, right? Even sometimes 22 on paper sounds great, but looking at the needs of students, sometimes it dictates that we have lower class sizes. So we're always looking at that. I'm appreciative that you're appreciative of having this town hall. And I'm thrilled to see as many people here that are here tonight. I would have also been thrilled if there was one person, because I think if we can, I was going to say, we know who the one person would be. But if, the more we can do to help everyone understand the financial realities that we're dealing with, and to hear from you, even if we only inform one person, to me that's a win. But it's great. It's great that so many people are here, and there were between 12 and 28 watching us tonight throughout the throughout the event. The presentation will be up on the website, along with the capital plan, along with the questions that were asked tonight. I hear you about taxpayer respite. One of the things, as we're looking, the reason that we're methodical in our needs-based budgeting is because we actually ask our principals and our directors to defend every line item of their budget. Not that it's an inquisition, but I asked Andy if I could get new blinds for my office. He asked me if it was a need. I still have old blinds in my office. But I mean, exactly. But we're that methodical because what we want to do is be able just to put our heads on the pillow at night and say that the recommendations we're making to the board around budget, our annual budget, make sure that we fund our K-12 education program the best way possible. With that, I think I'll wish you all a great night. It's Wednesday. No, it's Tuesday. It was really wishful thinking. By Friday, end of day, we'll have the information. It'll be under the news feature on the website. And truly, thank you all. It was nice meeting some of you tonight and seeing some familiar faces. And thank you for giving of your time tonight.